Actually, maybe I'll get us started right now. If you have just recently joined, my name is MJ Smith. I am the VP of Marketing here at Collab. As I mentioned in the chat, we have a ton of material to cover today. So normally I think people wait a couple of minutes for the stragglers to join, but I think we're just going to jump right into it here. Adam Keating is our CEO here at Collab. He has worked directly with many of the Fortune 500 companies that we've been fortunate enough to work with on their VAVE programs. And so it's given us a really interesting point of view on what is working well and what is maybe working not so well inside of large scale programs where the goal is really to deliver 8 or 9 figures of cost reduction every single year consistently. So we are going to be going through a framework that we've developed through those conversations and through our observations in the marketplace. Adam's going to take you through that. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, I'll either tee them up to Adam as he goes along, but more likely I will ask them all at the end. But you can drop those anytime, either in the chat or the Q&A module in Zoom. And this will also be recorded, so you can share it with other people inside your organization. And with that, I will hand it over to Adam.
Thank you, MJ, and good afternoon, everyone. Looking really forward to this presentation today and talking about the Enterprise Leader's Guide to Effective VAV, especially now in 2023, where a lot of things have changed. MJ was right. We've got a busy 60 minutes. I'm thinking we'll probably talk for 45 to 50, then leave about 10 for questions. We're going to start with the state of VAV. Where are we today? And think about that approach we're talking about for more modern programs and anchored around 5 key pillars that we've seen successful in other businesses. We'll give you a very quick, simple 3-step process at the end that you can take, a new program and develop it, or an existing one and improve it. We'll show you a couple of examples of companies who have done this 5-pillar program and gotten success, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. So with that, let's jump into it. The state of VAVE. So the very first thing that I think is important to position here is, like, we talk about value analysis, value engineering. The acronym VAV is often what's used in short form. Most times when you hear someone say that, they tend to mean value analysis. If you think about what they're talking about at Target, you think about the activities they're talking about, usually workshops, a lot of times it's focused on the analysis part. And a big part of our perspective is that won't be good enough going forward. So if you think about value analysis, really looking at existing products, things that are in production, you're identifying and implementing design changes or other changes that decrease the cost or improve the value, or ideally both, for the product. Value engineering, very similar approach, but integrated upstream in new product development being the major key change. One of the core beliefs, I think, things we've learned in the last 4 years is that the teams that are really embedding VAV in their engineering orgs are seeing a massive upswing in their actual ability to hit those big targets, because it's right at the source of where a lot of the decisions are being made early on in new programs. So when we think about engineering-led cost reduction or engineering-led VAV, we're talking about the value analysis, value engineering, the actual implementation, execution of changes to the design of the product. And that'll be sort of the core tenet of what we'll talk about here today. The interesting thing is, VAV as a whole has never been more important. Inflation is cutting into margins. Globalization is making competition ever more intense and starting a race to the bottom in many places. And then you think about the impact of supply chain, you don't quite have the liberty you once had to be able to go back and negotiate. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices and find that cost elsewhere. And at the same time, there's a lot of things holding these teams back. And if you look across all the teams we've worked with, whether it's in automotive or industrial, big or small, it doesn't really matter. There's 8 key challenges we tend to see. The first is that some programs don't really have a structure, clear goals, or timelines. So it's always an extra project that never gets prioritized. The second is that incentives are not driving the right behaviors. How many times have we had a target where it only captures the value if you look at the next 12 months and something in production, so people leave the cost in the product the first time to engineer it out later? Not really what the business wants, but it is what the KPI asks for. The third is that it's very workshop event driven, which has worked really well, but it's disconnected from the day-to-day work. So it makes implementation hard. It makes it difficult to get all those other people in, and it's expensive to be able to actually do. Big focus on VA, not quite enough on the VE, especially for the cost side of value engineering. Lots of teams have good value management teams built in, but there's not a lot of that happening at the engineer level day to day when they're making those early design decisions. Implementation, we hear about it all the time. We had a great workshop. You've got a whole bunch of ideas. It takes 6 weeks to translate them, and then nobody really knows where anything is to afterwards. And it's just lost in the sea of all the other changes. You then look at things closer to the team. You've got subject matter experts who have been at this 20 and 30 years who are underutilized because they're busy and it's hard to actually get them into these places where it's effective use of their time. And at the same time, those subject matter experts are not really talking to each other about lessons being learned on one side versus the other, creating silos in the org. And the very last part is really thinking back to that first comment about the engineering side. Not having engineering deeply involved in this and feeling ownership of it blocks a lot of the interesting things you can do early in a program to really get the best benefit for your VAB program. And the interesting thing about all of this now is that with these targets getting higher and higher and higher, we're kind of challenging ourselves to say we need to make up this gap. Because right now, just making incremental improvements or doing one extra workshop isn't going to make the change, because people are starting to give up on the targets. I've had VA leaders talk to me and tell me their target is $40-50 million. I talked to their engineering team, their chief engineers, and they've almost wrote it off because it's such a big number with so many other competing priorities. So we need to think about a new approach that helps us take a couple of smart steps to making that gap not so scary, something that's a little more tangible, something that we can get into with the team. So with that, we'll take you through sort of our approach and what we've been seeing in the industry work for modern VAB teams. And that approach really can be summarized sort of in 5 key pillars. The first and most important one really is the same as traditional. It really comes back to people, but more importantly, getting it right and making sure that engineering is leading and heavily involved in that process. Step 2 is looking at the program as a whole and thinking very critically about the structure, the goals, and most importantly, the incentives, so that you actually get the outcomes you're looking for. Step 3, back to the idea generation. And here we're not just talking about workshops or negotiating with suppliers. We're talking about new ways to think about generating ideas that are easier for your team to do and higher quality for your team to implement. We then look at execution because, an idea is only so good if nothing happens with it. How do we make that easier and cut out some of the manual work that slows it down today? And then I think one of the things I see as most interesting and the biggest future opportunity is how do we leverage data and new technology to make this just an automated thing? Whether it's something like bringing lessons learned from one program to the next, generative design, data and insights. How can we use that kind of technology to really optimize designs, both for value and for cost? So when you think about that, before we get into even the pillars, first tip we give here is that it needs to prioritize engineering-led VAVE. Your traditional procurement supply chain focus, still important, but it is important that your engineering leadership, your chief engineers, folks closest to it, are actually driving towards the same goal. Because without that, you're going to have an uphill battle all the time. When you think about the people front, it really goes back to the organization. And the most important person in that org is going to be your executive sponsor. This might be somebody from procurement or supply chain. This might be someone dedicated directly to VAV. It might even be an engineering leader. But knowing that that is the ultimate champion, accountable to the target, the program, motivating the group, communicating about it, is the first most important step. Beneath that, you really want to have a structure of VAVE champions. Oftentimes, we're seeing chief engineers or engineering managers step up. They then take, a portion of that target and own it. And the accountability is super important here. They then have the ability to bring in suppliers, customers, partners to be smart about how they execute that program. And then you've got the people with the ideas. You've got your engineers, you've got your suppliers, your customers, your mechanical designers, sourcing folks, bringing those into the program. with one special piece that I think we've seen work really well. So subject matter expert teams, sort of cross-functional, cross-division, that brings kind of the best from one place to the other, has worked really, really well. A company like Johnson Controls started working with them probably about 4 years ago. And I think one of the best things they ever did was bring some consistency to a couple of key players across all of their events and across their teams that then taught other people how to think that way and brought knowledge from one place to the rest. So it can be a low effort investment if you do it right with the events and styling, but a high return in terms of the quality you're actually going to see for your team. So when you think about this, tip 2 from building this program is it's really important to designate these official roles. Having this as like an informal thing is tricky. Most organizations don't have the liberty to build out and hire specific folks to run this, even the big ones. So oftentimes it is another hat that somebody is wearing. But it's important to think about who those people are and making it clear that it's part of their roles and responsibilities, that they're compensated for it as part of their performance. Because without that, it's always going to be an afterthought, especially today when there's so much pressure on speed and quality. The cost part can be, a pretty easy part to leave to the side. When it comes back to the program, the first part that it's interesting, like when we first started talking about this, I'm not sure I spent most of my time here, but over the last year in particular, it's become clearer and clearer that a lot of the idealistic things I've talked about just don't work because the incentives are wrong. People aren't motivated to pull it out the first time because it's just not what's rewarded. And there's a trade-off at any point between speed, quality, and cost. I think thinking about what your VAV program ought to be, how you want the core process to work, how you want to think about incentivizing and rewarding people is extremely important. Because if you think about, a company like Colab, how we set OKRs and targets incentivizes all of the behavior of the company. And this is no different here for VAV. So when you take that and break it into sort of the value analysis component, when you look at it from a people perspective, you've got your engineering managers and chief leading. You've got them supported by a subject matter expert team and the folks in procurement, supply chain. Ideally, they're incentivized through compensation, if not at least performance reviews. And they need to find smart ways to leverage their suppliers and customers as well to generate those ideas. From a process and technology perspective, there's a combination of live VA events or workshops, more frequent VA reviews, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, and then also trying to reduce the dependency on being in person, because then you're really bottlenecking how much you can do in terms of idea generation. On the other side of the house, the value engineering is much more integrated. It needs to be something that is a part of the core design process, or it's always going to become an afterthought or somebody else's job. Value engineering at the core should be happening with the engineers on any new project, and a part of even just a core review process. You think about those checklists that people work through, part of each of those shouldn't just be for quality. It should be for value. It should be for cost, and ultimately bring that back right into the core of the program. So if you get those people that are leading NPD with that subject matter expert team, again, incentivized to do it right the first time and actually rewarded, you can start to see some interesting things if you bring down the barrier to entry for actually creating those ideas and capturing that value. And wrapping it all together is, how do you take all those ideas, all those great things with a million competing priorities, capture it all, prioritize it, and then ultimately track it through to completion? Getting a good implementation system is critical. This is often one of the places we see teams struggle the most. So when you think about sort of the next step in all this process, it's how do you actually generate these ideas? And I hear workshop. I see it in folks' titles on LinkedIn. It's often very workshop driven, which we've seen lots of incredible workshops. So there's nothing wrong with it. There's lots of other things we can do as well. So we'll talk about 6 ways to generate ideas. First one, I've actually called it continuous VA reviews instead of workshops. Because what we're seeing is that there is the workshop, it could be a week long. You might fly people to a plant, spend time together. But we're also now starting to see them a little more informal, like a design review might be, with a bunch of folks virtually. And those are a lot lower barrier to entry. There's next to zero cost. You can do it with your CAD model instead of having to bring expensive people to a plant or model to you, and do these things live and asynchronous. And it's a bit more of a continuous thing than it actually is, 4 or 5 big workshops a year. Second part then is really truly investing in embedding value engineering into your core review process. And the key in this one is like it really being part of what the engineers are doing day to day. If it's an extra step, it's not going to happen, with the exception of some folks who really care. It needs to be something that's just part of it, second nature. You then got optimizations around suppliers, it might be tooling, DFM, process, how you build things, and manufacturing. You have BOM cost downs, very key part and clear opportunity. Analyzing change requests, an interesting way to think about you're already being asked to change a component. Can we use VAV as a format to think about how can we do that better for both the customer, but also for us in terms of cost? And the last one is something new we're seeing, which is more of like a supplier-driven or supplier-led ideation. Under this concept we call co-design, we bring your suppliers in way earlier in the process, like right up front in the earliest stages of design, where you take them as trusted partners and really think about, what is possible. What can they do? What new technologies do they have that could end up increasing the value of your product, make it easier to manufacture, and ultimately improve the cost? So for today, we're going to spend most of the time talking about number 1 and 2, the continuous VA reviews and the integrated value engineering. And in a future talk, we're going to get deeper into the other 4 idea generation mechanisms. So when you think about kind of the VA reviews and the types of events they can range from something like, what we see work really well is a live kickoff for the year, something that gives the entire organization clarity around what the goal is, the target, where the team is focusing in terms of programs, key areas within those programs to focus on, and then what to expect in terms of timeline, process, and opportunity. Doing this up front is really important because without it, words start flying through the organization around, is this target reasonable? How are we going to do this? Nobody has a plan. So doing this as the executive sponsor should be step 1 in any VAV program, making the program, delivering it clearly, and then ideally do something right away. Get a big win, get the team working, and it might look something like one of those live VAV workshops. So one of the things I think we've seen over and over again pre-COVID was that people would fly to one place, sit in a boardroom for a week or 2. They put a bunch of sticky notes on the whiteboard or on a product. They go to a plant, capture ideas, put them in a spreadsheet. 6 weeks later, it's all tabulated, and then somebody tries to do something with it. What we'll talk a little bit more about is, how can we make that virtual, less onerous, and a little more fun? And one of the interesting parts in doing that is you can bring in more people, you can group them, time box it, and actually make it competitive. We've seen teams now actually make their VA workshops a bit of a competitive exercise to say, here are the key systems, split into 4 or 5 teams, look at them. And if you're working all from one place, say like a virtual model, you can see all the ideas generating. So it cuts out all the duplicates, it tracks everything for you, and you can really come back and almost make a bit of fun out of this and crown a champion as well in that and make people take pride in their work. The next part then is kind of the new piece of this. And it's very similar to the value engineering mindset that I'm talking about, which is like building it in. I think the key here is thinking about, VA doesn't need to be a big workshop. It doesn't need to be a huge scope. You could take a subsystem from one of your core products. There's opportunity to fix a component, schedule what feels like a design review, execute that virtually, capture all those ideas, which we'll talk about how best to do in a moment, and do this on a frequent basis so that muscle is constantly being flexed by the team to be thinking about value and cost in every step of the process. So if you think about, how do you do that? Some of the things we've done in working with teams through Colab is give them a virtual environment that's a lot more rich than just sharing, a CAD model on a screen with someone taking notes in OneNote through a Teams meeting. We're talking about taking like your native 3D data with your drawings, your bill of materials, any other specifications, bringing that into one collaborative environment that you can all access from anywhere in the world. So you could have 5 people, you could have 100 people. We've seen both ends of the spectrum. You then give people the ability to take, the proverbial sticky note and put it right on the place where they see it as if they were there in real life. So you put it right on the geometry, right on the drawing, right on the line item in the BOM. So that is very clear. And doing this alone not only gives you the ideation of kind of a visual hotspot of what's going on, but it also makes the downstream ideation and capture and prioritization much easier because it's already there in a system for you. And the last part of that is like, if you're capturing these in something like a virtual environment where it is actually tying back to your model, all of it's going to be there at the end. I talked to a VA leader yesterday, and they told me that on average, from the time they finish, a big workshop, a week-long workshop, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for the VA leader to compile all the notes, summarize them, take the relevant screenshots and things, put it into something useful, and then give a spreadsheet back to the engineering chief to actually do something with. By that time, most times, the engineering chief is forgotten. The context is lost. Let's picture you're doing something like a wire harness where you're talking about coverings. Which covering, where? It's very complicated. And then you almost redo the whole process over again. If we can just make that context there and automate the rest of that, you can start executing on these things the next day. So the big takeaway here, outside of thinking about the different types of events and thinking about, something being asynchronous, and thinking about how you do that, like what I just described doesn't need to be a live event. This could be asynchronous because a tool like Colab, all that's being tracked throughout. The big thing, though, I would say is making this fun and competitive is going to encourage people to do it. So encourage people to come back. If you can make it smart with their time, they're going to want to do it. We've seen it in companies today where they invest maybe 1 to 2 hours rather than a week and make it very clear what the goal is. We tell them how it went and make a little bit of fun out of who was the top, VA ideator. And people come back and do it. We've seen them do it 12, 14, 15 times in a year because it's easy and a little bit of fun. Now on to the ugly truth. Something that I think I hear in every single conversation is that truly for the VAVE target, the cost number, companies are severely underinvesting in value engineering. Maybe doing the value part up front, thinking about how to make this product work. When it comes to cost, it's almost always an afterthought. And Todd Dearson, one of the leaders and thought leaders in the space around VAVE, he said it so well. He said, when you're competing to get a new product out there, you don't have time for value engineering. And so now we get to do it again and again, the value analysis. And it makes us look like heroes on the backside. But unfortunately for value engineering, it makes us look like we're idiots because we didn't do it the first time. And it's harsh, but true. And I've heard many leaders say the same thing, because oftentimes the incentives aren't right. There isn't time there for it. And there's no easy way to do it. So you have a few folks pushing this and a whole bunch of other people freaking out about the timeline, and it doesn't happen until much later. So I think the very first thing to think about is for your organization, when you think about your target, how much are you doing really on the value analysis side versus what you could be doing earlier, which is actually going to have the bigger impact for the company. If you really think about the business model, getting it out early will ultimately be better, even if that doesn't impact KPI. KPI we got to figure out in terms of incentive alignment. Because when you look at, all of you have seen this curve before, when you think about a product life cycle, the opportunity for actually really getting savings is early in high volume programs, even before you start manufacturing. The later we go, the less we're getting. And ultimately, it's like the cost trade-off here is almost not even worth it from the effort perspective. But most teams just aren't doing this. They're not prioritizing doing it right away, or they're waiting until volumes ramp up because they're only getting 12 months recognition for an idea being implemented. And if you're in a spot where you can help with those incentives, it's really important to go back to it because you want your team doing VA and VE where it matters most and where it can impact the overall performance of that program on like a 10-year window, much more than a 1-year window, the most. So when you think about that, the thing that we've seen work is taking value engineering and it not being just a couple people's jobs, but actually integrating it directly into every engineer's job. The same way quality, to a degree, is every engineer's role. They test it, they make sure it works, they review drawings, they make sure things go out the first time and don't have mistakes. Very similar approach when it comes to cost and value. And to do that, it needs to be built right into the design and review process from day one. If you've got those checklists, if you've got a review workflow or technology you're using, it needs to be there so that when an engineer is finding other problems, it's easy for them just to tag an idea for increasing value or reducing cost, and then be able to move on so someone else can see all those ideas and help figure out and prioritize what to actually tackle. One of the interesting parts here is back to that incentive framework, thinking about how do you reward performers that are doing that. I think about it all the time in building a software company, that we have people that are solving the value problem all the time for our customer, but they're figuring out the cost equation along the way. They're optimizing how data is handled. They're thinking about the performance impact of changing a query. And that's something we reward in performance review, and something that can be done similarly for engineers and the teams that are investing in it. So with all that, you get lots of ideas. And I hear all the time, there's like this chasm people are trying to cross between, idea created and then idea actually executed and value realized. And I think the execution part is so critical. The biggest gap we see today is that the team who captures this stuff and the team who's actually going ahead to do it, there's oftentimes a big gap. There's also a big time gap usually between the two. So one of the things we see the best teams doing, whether it's a SharePoint file, a really sophisticated spreadsheet, tool like Colab, at least have one place where all this stuff is living. Ideally, that tool, you can add some smarts to it. So if you're actually capturing these ideas during an event, they just automatically roll up. And it's like one of the core tenets of why we built the product we built was that we don't want engineers or people in supply chain or procurement spending any of their time doing documentation. It's not value adding, and it actually is a blocker to people wanting to do it. So if you can think about, how do we actually take what they're doing and log it to make it easy to prioritize, that's going to make it a lot easier to get people in. Especially when you think back to the beginning, we talked with subject matter experts. If they can come in for 30 minutes and then get out, their ideas are captured and actually get prioritized, that's going to motivate them to want to keep doing that. And the other nice part about doing this is over time, if you're tracking it, you start to learn what's working, where the highest value places are going to be, how long it really is taking. So then you can start planning for future years to kind of front load those events, to actually get them at the right points in the year to ultimately hit that target. So when you look at that, there's really three things to think about. The first part is capture. Most teams today, it's sticky notes or spreadsheets or a note, and then going into a spreadsheet at the end. Use a smart way to capture that data from everybody first time. I think the famous situation in the virtual world now is like a Microsoft Teams meeting with someone spinning a model, people giving directives, and then someone taking notes. Think about smart ways that we can do that. It might be a whiteboarding tool. Folks use tools like FigJam or Miro for different brainstorms. You could use Colab on a 3D model. Think about things that are actually capturing the rich data as they're generated, so it's not an extra step. The second part then is like, you're going to get a lot of ideas, ideally. Off those ideas, some of them are worth it. Most of them are probably not. So the second most important part here is like giving your team a really simple way, quick way to constantly be prioritizing. That can look like, you've got an issues list you're rolling with in Jira or your sophisticated spreadsheet, but ideally it's a tool that's capturing all this new information constantly, where you're always pulling the big ones to the top and selecting those then for implementation. With the ideal piece being at the end, you can actually track that all the way through. I spoke to a VA leader last week, and they told me that, they do these events, they eventually get all the issues or all the ideas. At the end of that, then they go chasing people around, really not knowing where anything's to the whole time. And they're relying on their schedule, which relies on somebody else's updates to actually know if they're going to hit the target. It's really nice if you can build in that implementation, all those review processes, all those steps, kind of right into this one system, so that your executive sponsor and VAV champions can really see how things are progressing throughout that life cycle. So at the end of this, the big takeaway here, and it's a multi-step journey, it isn't going to happen overnight, is automate the tracking. Because one of the biggest burdens in doing VAV is trying to take care of all the manual work. If you asked an engineer if they were okay with reviewing a model to think about solving a problem, that's one thing. If you're asking them to do a big VA event where they need to do a bunch of prep work, show up for a week, take all these notes, then go decipher everyone else's notes afterwards, to then make decisions, to then go do more work, that doesn't sound near as enticing. So being able to get this out of their way so that they can just do the ideation and then review each other's ideas is a much simpler way. And you could think of it, could be as simple as scripting tools you write, it could be as complicated as putting a full cost management tool or value management tool in place. But the ideal aspect is that it captures it where the person is working as they're working. And the last part, which is probably like my favorite piece of the puzzle now, is thinking about, us as technical folks or building complex products, we are generating so much data. And I always give the example that, a sales organization has all these tools. They've got Salesforce, they've got tools like Gong for call recordings and analyzing, tools like SalesLoft to know how their sales development team is doing. And everybody knows every single KPI and where everything is trending. In engineering or in VAVE, oftentimes the only thing we really know is where are we on the target right now? And where are we in the schedule right now? It's very, very hard to get any lead indicator. It's very, very hard to take data from other places and use it. Think about your last lessons learned session. Where is that data now? At worst, it's in a Google Doc or a Word doc. At best, it's in a knowledge management system, which most people still don't look at. How can we take that information and bring it to the forefront every single time to make us make smarter decisions from data? And the way we think about this is really like a 3-piece process. In order for there to be good data, it's got to be dead simple. VAV has to be super easy. If it's not easy, people are outside, data's lost in sheets, and you're never going to find it. You then want to automate that capture. And if you automate the capture, the data will be there. People will love it. They'll keep doing it. And then once the data is there, you really can start to derive those insights. And I'll give a couple examples in a moment of where this has worked. It could look like things like, what are the top issues that are coming up? What are the top recalls or changes? It could be where bottlenecks are in the process, or things you can't change from a supplier, or which supplier is actually doing a better job of helping you cost out. And it gives you that insight that you've lost forever. So thinking about just collecting the data, leveraging it, visualizing, and make decisions from it is a huge mindset shift. And with all these new technologies now coming out, so something like, in the automotive space, competitive benchmarking, tools like A2 Mac 1, where you can go in and look at, scan of another vehicle and think about ideation, becomes even more powerful to start collecting that data. You look at new tools like, in topology, doing generative design, you can set boundary conditions and criteria that you want to optimize for weight or optimize for cost, whatever it might be. You can start doing these things differently, where we're not just solely relying on the ideas that our team has. Software can start to tell us, competitors are doing X. We have an ability to lightweight here, and things that we can really do that we couldn't do before. Then you look at tools, something like an OpenBOM or another, cost analysis tool. You can actually go in and really see where the cost is, visualize that, and be able to pull that back down all the way to something which could range from being like a collab type tool to another whiteboarding type software, or anything like even Microsoft Teams in between, to help your team just work together and ideate. And with all of that, then over time, especially this push in AI, you can really start pulling cost out and increasing the value and tying all this data together to make better decisions. So you think about like, how do you do something with this? We break this down into 3 simple steps. First one is like, whether it's a new program or a mature one that you're trying to improve, start small. Start with a program or a product, grab a group, focus on the major events for VA first, embrace the ability then to, weave in some of those smaller, asynchronous reviews, get a champion in that group, make it clear what their target is, and prove that you can get that motion moving. That champion then ultimately has the tools in place to be able to automatically track. So by doing that, you're building the muscle memory of how this should look. Step 2 then is repeating that across multiple programs, ideally with that champion educating the next one, and the subject matter experts being formed across those groups that can then take, in step 3 here, this to the whole company, where you're now not only just doing VA, but you're able to actually start taking these lessons learned, feeding it into upstream new product development, and really capturing that from day one from a value engineering perspective. So at the end of the day, really, if you think back to that diagram a moment ago, you're making it easy for people to do it. You're automating the low value work, and you've now got data and insight to say, based on this new program, it's very similar to the last. Here is where we should invest, and our team will focus on the part that's most important. And then you can start really looking at other more advanced things, whether simulations or competitive benchmarking, to really take that next jump and get into that next stage. So if you look at, just thinking about that as a whole, one of the things we're building now is actually a maturity model around what does it look like to be, an early stage team with VAV and being expert in field. something we're hoping to release probably in the next quarter or so. So stay tuned for a little bit more on that one. So the last thing I'll leave you with is a couple examples. I talked about Johnson Controls early on, team we've known very well for almost 4 years. I would say some of the pioneers in doing this virtually in the early days of COVID. But, a leader like Brian Stouffer, very passionate about getting this into people's hands and bringing the knowledge out and taking the rest of the process and administrative work away. And I think what we saw there very early on was that an event that would typically produce 100 opportunities in a week in a plant with a group of 5 or 6 turned into a virtual event that might have run an hour live and an hour asynchronously with a group of 30 or 40 very different perspectives all over the world, generating about double the number of ideas with way less duplicates, because you could see them actually around, in this case, a chiller system, where the hotspots were, what people were looking at, were they looking at the evaporator, a condenser, or something else, and focus their attention to what mattered most. And I think the outcome of that, just a single event can save, $2 million. And then down the road, it became muscle memory where these are just happening every month, every couple of weeks type of thing across all these systems, and continuously just getting better and opening up the door for that. Then you look at the complete opposite example, a very fast growing company called Mainspring Energy, building a next generation linear generator. They had a new process where they were saying, we need to redesign a key component in our system to try and engineer cost out. And by doing this during the design process early on in this new version, a new iteration, not only were they doing the design review and the quality side much faster, in the end resulted in almost a 50% reduction as well in schedule, but they could see all these ideas come out of every single review and basically figure out where could they pull cost. And the result of that after 6 months was almost 50% or a little more than 50% of the budget of that product being engineered out before it even went back to production for the next run. And that type of thing then can carry over to the next build because they've built that memory. It's built right into their design review process. They've now got that ingrained in their checklists that are built into that tool. And it's very easy, second nature to be able to get there. And the last example is a large heavy equipment company that's similarly used the ability to tag ideas. As you're going through just a design review, it was second nature for someone to say, here's an ability to catch something early. Here's an idea that we can implement. And doing that, over the course of 6 months, they've estimated here that's going to reduce the entire manufacturing cost by 11% on a 8-9 figure program, just because they had it there early. Something that they never would have done until afterwards when VA kicked in. So it gives you an ability to really keep those processes moving. So in conclusion, if you think about kind of the modern program, we often talk about people, process, product. I think back to those 5 pillars. It's the people, it's the program structure and incentives. It's really diversifying idea generation, automating idea execution and management, and then thinking about a couple of smart bets when it comes to data and how you can optimize that process. At the end of it, you think back to those tips, prioritize and incentivize both VA and VE for your program, get those champions, subject matter expert group working, and make sure that the engineering team is heavily engaged. Incentives, targets, and program structure need to be right to motivate the team. And if you get those right, you'll see much better buy-in. Don't rely solely on in-person events. If you can really get the virtual ideation going, both in the async and live version, it's going to work out, and make that competitive, make it a little bit of fun. When you think about, where's the biggest value, invest early, find those high volume programs, invest in those value engineering teams, really your engineering team in value engineering, and make that a part of your culture at your company. And the last part, probably my favorite part, and I think the most important part, is automate the stuff that nobody wants to be doing, because that's going to make it easier for them to feel good about the work they're doing and come back and help again. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining us today. I am more than happy to take some questions. I think MJ, we did okay, 40 minutes, maybe a couple minutes quicker, as we'll take some questions for 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I'm impressed, Adam, that you got through that whole deck in 40 minutes. All right, so I have a couple of questions for you. If anybody else has additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A while Adam is answering the first couple here. So the first one is from someone whose team is actually actively evaluating implementing Colab. And he was already kind of thinking of hosting a kickoff event. So he's curious if you could share any best practices from the companies that we have helped already with specifically the kickoff event, or just ways that Colab approaches a kickoff in the early stage alongside sort of the training, support, and onboarding that we do with customers.
So I think the really important part is like whoever that champion is, like whoever, so you think about your sponsor, that's your program owner. You then think about the person who's responsible for that event. It's usually an engineering manager or a chief. That person there is the owner of event number one. When you think about that event, the most important part is not about Colab. It's not about the tool. It shouldn't be about training. If we got to do a lot of training, we're going to lose people along the way. So the work needs to be with the champion to set the folks up so that they just come in and immediately see the value. Because otherwise, they're going to go back to the ways they're used to doing it. So for a new event, what we tend to see, let's say you're running one with a group of 10 engineers and one of your suppliers, we'd like to see a champion create a couple of slides that outlines what is the goal. What are we focused on? Is there a target? Things to stay away from, things to focus on, just to frame the initiative. That can be uploaded in Colab. Everyone can see it. We then suggest taking all the engineering data, so maybe your 3D model, the drawings, bill of materials, putting that into what we call a package. That package then is basically like a PowerPoint deck, but it's all native live data, and you can guide people to the right spot. So by doing those two things, and then just linking those people, the presentation you created and the package of engineering data, they open up in their browser for the first time they log in, right in the context of where they need to be. And then your training is one button. There's a pin and some markup tools right next to it. You show them how to click those and drop it on there, summarize and hit enter. And that's it. That's all you ask the team to do. And by doing that, they're able then to basically come in. Triage model is going to feel just like their CAD viewer or something else. It's not going to be foreign, but they're just putting ideas in. And then the VA leader after or during can prioritize and set the next steps. But by doing that, they're not really thinking so much about Colab. You've set the stage for what's important for your business. You've given them access to it and guided them through, what might be a complicated model, so they're not fumbling. And then they're just dropping pins or dropping markups, and that's it. So I think the key here is like, you do a bit of work up front. Maybe it's an hour or 2 hours investment for the VAV champion. The engineering team just simply goes in and creates their ideas. Suppliers create their ideas. They leave, you prioritize, and then you can move from there.
Very nice. All right, we've got quite a few more questions while you were answering that one. Do you have any best practices to set SMART targets for VAVE initiatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the first part is actually thinking about what's achievable and what's reasonable. I think the thing I've heard the most from people that are not taking the target seriously is that they're just handed down a number that doesn't really connect to reality. So if you think about, the example you have with Johnson Controls, the reason their targets are SMART is because they're looking at the actual programs and the product lines, starting from there and saying, here's where the maturity is, here's where they are in their life, here's where the opportunity is, and they're rolling that together so they know there's something real there. They know there's something to focus on. So if you think about the goals that work best, just saying you have a $20 million target and not doing the underlying work doesn't work. So something MJ will tell you when we do revenue planning, a top-down look won't work on its own. A bottoms-up look won't work on its own. The best way to set these targets is combining the two and iterating and doing it up front so that when you go into that kickoff event for the year, you're setting your team up for success. It might be ambitious, but for success. And then you're explaining to them where it's going to come from, where your vision is, what program, maybe you just launched something new and you knew that, the chassis was way over designed or you needed to re-architect one of the systems. Give them some of those ideas and then create little milestones. Maybe it's based on program, maybe it's based on time. And then ultimately, if you set up those events, you'll start to see the action happening and people actually taking those goals and really being able to achieve them.
Awesome. I have another question here. How can companies share confidential data with a web-based app?
Good question. So in terms of like testing it out, if you're trying to just kind of get a sense of like what this might look like, we can actually do a workshop with you if you'd like. What we can do is we can actually sign an NDA. We can bring in one of your models. It might be something that's already in production, and let you actually just do a workshop before you ever really sign up to using Colab. When it comes to like, proper implementation as a business, we work with companies across all major manufacturing verticals. Everyone we're working with is dealing with high sensitive IP. So in terms of security, it's like the first thing we think about when it comes to sharing data. Something we didn't talk about in today's topic is more the supply chain side. We've actually built a solution for you to be able to work with suppliers too in a much more secure way. So when you come back to confidential data, if you want to look at from a SOC 2 perspective or a data integrity perspective, we can walk you through there. But I would say from a product perspective, it's also built in a way that, let's say that, Colab is an OEM, we're working with a bunch of suppliers. You can do reviews inside of a workspace. You can then invite people into what we call a portal, which is like a limited slice of the workspace where it doesn't duplicate the data, but you control what they can see. Anything that happens in the portal comes back to you. Anything that happens in the workspace doesn't go to them. So fundamentally, I say at the ground level, the IP protection is a core part of what we do. I think it's nice because from a VA perspective, you could have an event running with your internal team. You could share it in a portal to 3 or 4 other groups. Maybe it's competing suppliers even. They don't see each other, but you see everything in one spot. So from that perspective, we can really help you make a step change moving forward.
Does Colab also help in idea development and evaluation by creating CAD, FEA analysis, et cetera, for the ideas generated? Or, how would you suggest teams approach that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So today we don't do analysis viewing natively. So you can actually export results from that. It could be in a PDF form or an image. You can screenshot anything you want into Colab live in those 3D slides. I would say long-term, our goal is to be able to allow you to view just about anything. So over time, we started with mechanical CAD, it bridged into drawings, then bridged into documentation, images. We're now hearing questions about ECAD, analysis, all sorts of other information. And our goal is to be able to let you view any of those things together so you can also make decisions without needing other tooling to do that.
Adam, I'm not sure if you are familiar with fast diagrams, but somebody has a question: how can you make that sort of diagram easy to understand for a team that doesn't have much knowledge about it? And perhaps even if you're not specifically familiar with a fast diagram, maybe you could just talk about making some of these concepts more digestible for people, especially since one of our tenets we've been talking about is bringing in people who you normally don't invite to these events virtually.
Yeah, I think in general on that question, like one of the core parts I talked about earlier to the first question is like the most important aspect here is guiding people through. So if it's a diagram, a complex diagram, you're trying to walk someone through, making that digestible, using something like a package in Colab, where you can guide them through the knowledge so that they're not taking, let's take an example of a new vehicle and trying to actually go through and look at, a full car. How are you focusing someone, right? So you look at the braking system, you might look at a specific issue that came up. And ultimately then that then directs their focus for specific frameworks, whether it's a diagram or something else. You can bring those things right into Colab as well and actually do the review process on it. So if you're trying to teach somebody, you can actually give them that feedback, right? One thing that came up recently from a customer was, we use the A3 format for actually doing evaluations of problems and issues. How can we make people better at doing that, understanding that? Use the Colab review engine. So it's beyond VAVE. We also support design review of just about anything engineering related. So it could be like your first time looking at your model. It could be production drawing, documentation, but there's an opportunity there. I'd be happy to connect directly on that one after specific questions.
I want to come back briefly to the question about SMART targets because I failed to mention to you that SMART was capitalized. So it's like the specific, measurable, relevant, time bound. And I think your answer actually did talk about a lot of those elements, but I want to come back to time bound specifically. I think it'd be interesting to hear your commentary thinking about that sort of step 1, step 2, step 3 roadmap that you put up in front of everyone earlier. Like, how do you, with teams that are implementing these types of things in their business for the first time, how do you think about what to start with and how long that might take in terms of scope?
Yeah, I think the most important part is you need to get value for your team, or at least make them feel like they've created value immediately on the first step, or else they're not going to buy into step two. So if I'm thinking about a smart target there, and you pick like the big year, you do the top down, bottoms up, get the number right, create some initiatives underneath that. Underneath that first initiative, plan an event right away. Like as soon as you deliver, here's the goal for the year, have a very specific event where your goal is very measurable. It's time bound. We're going to do it next week. There's 1 hour associated. You're going to have 5 more days to submit these. And at the end of it, the leadership team or the VAV leader is going to present back to the group on a certain day. Here are the top 5 ideas, and set a goal immediately that is publicly seen through the team of when those things are being implemented. I think in general, like one of the biggest things that MJ and I would talk about, whether it's collab programs or VAV programs, the accountability is critical for smart goals. If you're not committing to an actual date, you're not putting it actually out there, there isn't a plan around where it's going to be met and how it's going to be hit, no one's ever going to do it. So I think the critical part is something I didn't talk about in collab is all those issues I was talking about or ideas. It's like any other task management system. You can assign those to people. You can give them due dates and do all the things that are important in terms of setting those goals. But I think the big thing is just creating the space right away for something measurable, so your team gets a win, and then they want to do it again and again and again, because then the actual boundary will come down.
What about the supplier piece of this? How have you seen companies incentivize suppliers to participate in VAVE or customers?
So interesting part here, like we talked about those like 6 ways to generate ideas. The last one on the bottom, I would say, is actually the most important part, because VAV can be contentious with suppliers, because oftentimes most traditional programs are just haggling suppliers to cut their cost, right? That's like one of the easiest ways to pull cost out, is to get lower cost product or negotiate. But that's changed a lot with supply chain pressure. Teams now are starting to say, okay, we can't really do that. It's not as easy to move from one supplier to the rest. So we need to be partners. So what we're seeing now is really that like co-design effort. And it's not just for VAV, it's for design in general. And doing that allows you, in something like I described with the workspace and portals, to bring them in without causing IP problems and actually give those ideas up front. Bring them into a workshop, give their ideas during the workshop without it having to be this huge extra effort. So I think the real takeaway here is like, if you really want to get the value of suppliers, think about who the trusted ones are, invest in them as partners, and properly embed that upfront for value engineering, and then downstream when you're doing your workshops or VA reviews.
Awesome. That is the end of all of our questions. Before we wrap up, I want to highlight a couple of things. On this slide, there's a QR code. And if you scan that, it'll take you to Collab's website, where there's actually an interactive product tour. So if you want to give Collab a try, but you're not quite sure yet if it's the best fit for your organization, what you'll be able to do is actually click through that and see what it feels like to set up your own VAVE event. The other thing is on the topic of supplier relationships, next quarter, starting in March, we are going to be hosting a series of events specifically on how you can implement workflows that turn suppliers into partners in your business. So you'll hear a lot more concrete information about the stuff Adam just shared. We're also hosting another event in April with our friends at OpenBomb about the handoff from engineering to manufacturing for new product development teams. And if you are registered for this event, you will get email information if you'd like to sign up for any of those. Adam, is there anything you would like to leave the audience with before we wrap up here?
I see there's one more good question that just came in about cost estimation, should costing, product costing. How do you look at that? One thing I'll say is stay tuned. We're about to launch something in the next 6 weeks that actually allows you to do a lot of the cost estimation inside of Collab. It's not going to be an analysis-based tool, but for the ideation in terms of impact, effort, what the value is, you'll actually be able to do that level of tracking inside of Collab as well. And down the road, we'd like to actually get more into the smarts, I'll say, behind looking at your bill of materials and actually telling you, where this might actually want to be, looking at the processes and helping you with that. So if you have questions around that side of things, it's something that's actively being developed. I actually saw a little demo yesterday, and I'm a little giddy inside and excited for it. So if you want to see that soon, it'll be live in just a couple of weeks.